I've been doing this work for 12 years now, and I thought I understood the relationship between preservation and decay. I thought I knew what a body looked like after 70 years in the ground. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Dennis stood in the doorway of my workroom with that particular expression he gets when a case is going to be complicated, not difficult, just tedious in ways that create paperwork. A family wanted to exhume their sister for reburial closer to home. The deceased had been interred in 1952 at Glenwood Cemetery, Plot 447, Section K, historical restoration work. My specialty. I remember feeling grateful for the distraction because I'd spent the previous 3 days on a drowning victim, and that particular smell has a way of following you home. Ruth Pemberton came to the funeral home that afternoon to sign the authorization forms. She was 78, narrow-shouldered, with hands that shook slightly as she held her teacup. Dennis handled most of the conversation while I observed from my usual corner, taking notes about the deceased's original preparation. Her sister, the bride, had been named Catherine. Catherine Pemberton, 23 years old at the time of death. Heart attack, sudden and fatal, the morning of her wedding day. Ruth kept touching the rim of her cup without drinking, and when Dennis asked if she had any concerns about the condition of the remains, she said something I still think about. She said Catherine always looked like she was sleeping. Even then, even when they found her. The way she emphasized the word found made me look up from my notes. But Dennis was already moving on to discuss casket options and service times. The exhumation happened at dawn. Owen Hastings, the groundskeeper, had the grave opened by the time I arrived with the transport vehicle. The October air was cold enough to show breath, and the cemetery was silent, except for the scrape of Owen's shovel against the vault lid. He's a quiet man. Owen been working that cemetery for 20 years, but he talked more than usual that morning. He told me about sounds reported in Section K over the years. Crying, he said, or maybe singing, depending on who you asked. Night security had logged it multiple times. The graves in that section dated back to the 40s and 50s, he explained, and sometimes the groundskeeping crew refused to work there after 4 p.m. I remember nodding politely while checking my equipment manifest, thinking about how easily people spook themselves in liminal spaces. If you've ever worked night shifts like that, you know the silence isn't really silent. What do you think? When they lifted the casket, I noticed the weight distribution was off. 70 years of settling should make things feel heavier in certain ways. The wood deteriorates. The interior padding compresses. Moisture seeps in. This felt solid, balanced, wrong. We loaded it carefully onto the gurney and transported it back to the funeral home. Dennis wanted me to work overnight to avoid family traffic during business hours, which was fine. I prefer working alone anyway. I opened the casket at 9:30 p.m. Catherine Pemberton lay exactly as she'd been placed 7 decades earlier, dressed in a wedding gown of ivory silk with lace sleeves and a fitted bodice. But the silk wasn't yellowed or brittle. It was pristine. The lace hadn't separated from the seams. The small bouquet of white roses and baby's breath resting in her hands looked like they'd been cut that morning. No browning, no decay, petals still curved and soft. I checked the casket seal 3 times, thinking maybe it had been hermetically sealed, some kind of experimental preservation method from the 50s, but the gasket was standard rubber, cracked and useless. Air had been getting in for decades. Her skin looked wrong too, not waxy or leathered the way embalmed tissue presents after that much time. It had color, not lifelike exactly, but closer to it than anything I'd seen outside of cryogenic preservation, which didn't exist in 1952. I touched her hand, just standard examination protocol, and had to pull back immediately. The skin wasn't cold, not warm either, but not cold. Room temperature, maybe slightly above, like touching a window in summer. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, hands shaking enough that I had to brace my elbows on the table. That's when I heard the music. It was faint at first, barely audible, over the ventilation system. A waltz. Slow and elegant, with that particular crackling quality of old recordings played on phonographs with worn needles. I stood completely still, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like it was inside the walls. Dennis sometimes played classical music in the viewing rooms, but he'd left hours ago and the building's sound system was controlled by a panel in his office, which was locked. I walked through the entire building anyway, checking every room, every speaker, every possible source. Nothing. When I came back to the workroom, the music had stopped. I tried to focus on the work. Catherine needed a full assessment before we could proceed with the reburial preparation. I examined her carefully, inch by inch, documenting every detail. The embalming work from 1952 had been competent but basic, arterial injection, probably formaldehyde-based, with minimal cosmetic restoration. Nothing that would explain this level of preservation. I was leaning close, examining the injection sites on her neck, when I noticed her hands had shifted position, just slightly. The bouquet was tilted at a different angle than it had been in my initial photographs. Tell me if I'm overthinking this. I honestly don't know anymore. I checked my photos 3 times. The angle was definitely different. I must have bumped the table when I walked around it. I told myself, except I'm meticulous about spatial awareness in my work. I have to be. I took another series of photographs and continued the examination, moving down to check her fingernails for any signs of fungal growth or separation from the nail bed. That's when I saw the dirt. Not just surface soil from the exhumation. That would make sense. But packed dirt, dark and compressed, under the nails of her right hand. Fresh-looking dirt, not the dried clay and sediment you'd expect from a sealed casket environment. I used a small pick to extract samples from under each nail, collecting them in separate evidence tubes. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I'd moved past anxiety into that crystalline focus you get when something fundamentally wrong is happening, and you need to document every detail, because no one will believe you otherwise. I pulled up the original death certificate and coroner's report on my laptop. Cause of death: cardiac arrest, acute myocardial infarction. Time of death: approximately 6 a.m. Discovered by hotel staff at 8:30 when she didn't respond to door knocks. She'd stayed overnight at the hotel where the wedding reception was planned, getting ready with her bridesmaids. But there was a note at the bottom of the coroner's report: small and easy to miss, unexplained contusions on upper arms, and defensive posturing of hands noted. Lividity pattern inconsistent with stated position of body. Recommended further investigation. Another note, dated 3 days later, in different handwriting: family declined autopsy, case closed per request. I looked back at Catherine, at her perfect, impossible preservation, at the dirt under her nails, at the wedding dress she'd never gotten to wear down an aisle. The music started again at 2:15 a.m., the same waltz, slightly louder this time, and I could make out more detail: strings, a piano, the compression artifacts of early recording technology. I forced myself to stay in the workroom and keep working. I measured, photographed, documented. I examined the casket interior with a magnifying lens and UV light, looking for anything unusual. That's when I found the scratches. They were on the inside of the lid, near where her hands would have been, 4 parallel lines, shallow but distinct, in the white satin lining. The fabric was torn in thin strips, and beneath it, the wood showed marks, fingernail marks. I'd seen them before in cases of premature burial or incomplete sedation. They're unmistakable and horrible. But this casket had been sealed at the funeral home in 1952 and hadn't been opened since. The scratches shouldn't exist, unless she'd made them before burial, unless she'd been alive. I called Dr. Iris Vance at 6 a.m. The moment I knew she'd be awake. Iris is the county medical examiner, thorough and skeptical in exactly the right ways. I sent her my photographs and documentation, expecting her to tell me I was exhausted and seeing patterns in random degradation. Instead, she called me back within an hour and told me to bring the samples, all of them, directly to her office. Her voice had that tight quality it gets when something doesn't make sense in ways that bother her professionally. The forensic analysis took 3 days. Modern testing can reveal things the 1952 coroner never could have detected. Elevated levels of chloral hydrate in the hair samples, a sedative common in that era, petechial hemorrhaging in the preserved tissue around her eyes, invisible to the naked eye but clear under microscopy, hemorrhaging that indicated asphyxiation. And the dirt under her nails matched the soil composition of Glenwood Cemetery, Section K, Plot 447. But the mineral content and moisture level indicated it had been disturbed recently, within hours of the exhumation. Iris asked me if I believed in supernatural explanations. I told her I didn't know what I believed anymore. She said she'd file an amended report and recommend the case be reviewed by the State Forensics Board, but that it would likely go nowhere after 7 decades. No witnesses left. No suspects alive to charge. Just questions and evidence that made sense in terrible ways. Dennis wanted me to complete the restoration work so we could proceed with the reburial. Ruth Pemberton came back to the funeral home and asked me, very quietly, if I'd found anything unusual. I showed her the photographs of the scratches. She didn't seem surprised. She told me that Catherine had been engaged to a man from a prominent family, a man with a reputation for jealousy and control. She said Catherine had wanted to call off the wedding the week before, but the invitations were sent, the deposits were paid, and their father was business partners with the groom's father. She said the hotel room door had been locked from the inside, but the window was open. She said the family never asked questions because asking questions meant scandal, and scandal meant shame, worse than death. I'd really like to know if you'd have done the same thing in my place. I finished the restoration work. Catherine looks peaceful now, properly peaceful, in a way she didn't before. The unnatural preservation has started to fade. She looks like someone who's been dead for 70 years now, which is somehow more comforting than what she looked like when I opened that casket. We held a small service, just Ruth and a few distant relatives, and reburied her in a newer section of the cemetery, closer to Ruth's future plot. Ruth thanked me and said she thought Catherine could rest now. But I still hear the music sometimes, late at night when I'm working. That same waltz, crackling and distant, like it's playing in another room I can't quite reach. And I think about all the other graves out there, all the other deaths that were never quite right, all the other women who maybe didn't die the way the certificates say they did. I think about how preservation works, how we try to stop decay, how we present death as peaceful when sometimes it absolutely wasn't. I don't know if Catherine was trying to tell me something, or if I just finally learned to see what was there all along. I don't know if disturbing her grave gave her permission to speak, or if the evidence was always there and everyone chose not to look. What I know is this: she was warm when she should have been cold. She was preserved when she should have been dust. And somewhere in those 70 years, she scraped at the lid of her coffin hard enough to leave marks that shouldn't exist. I still do this work. I still prepare the dead for burial, still treat each body with the clinical detachment my training requires. But now, sometimes, I listen differently. I look more carefully. I ask questions that make people uncomfortable. Because some deaths don't want to stay quiet, and some bodies won't rest until someone finally sees the truth. If this part gives you chills, you're not alone. I still get them thinking about it.
Hey friends, thanks for watching. Tell me where you're watching from today so that I can connect with you. Most of you haven't subscribed, yet these chills exist because of you. If you love the scares, don't just watch, join us. Hit subscribe, give a thumbs up, let's keep the chills breathing. See you in the next story, if you dare.
I need to write this down while I still remember my own name, while the words still mean what they're supposed to mean. My father told me some questions are better left unasked, and I should have listened. I really should have listened. It started with a routine exhumation 3 weeks ago. The Garrison family wanted to relocate their grandfather from Hillcrest Cemetery to a newer memorial park closer to where the surviving children had settled. Standard procedure. I've supervised maybe 24 disinterments since I got my license, and they're always the same: paperwork, permits, a backhoe operator who works carefully around the vault, and a family who stands at a respectful distance pretending they're okay with disturbing the dead. This one should have been no different. Harvey Lund was operating the backhoe that morning. He's good at his job, methodical, the kind of guy who measures twice and digs once. I watched him work from the edge of the plot, checking the depth markers against the burial records. 6 feet down, standard depth for a 1989 interment. The vault should have been right there, but Harvey stopped at 5 feet, backed the bucket up and shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt wrong somehow, like the cemetery was holding its breath. "There's something else down there," he said, climbing out of the cab. Felt it catch on the teeth. We cleared the remaining dirt by hand, Harvey and I, using shovels and brushes like we were on an archaeological dig. That's when we found it. 6 inches below where Mr. Garrison's vault should have been, there was another coffin. Crude, mismatched wood held together with what looked like hand-forged nails and sealed at every seam with tar. No vault, no nameplate, no marker, just this thing, buried in a space that according to every map and record belonged only to Charles Garrison. Harvey looked at me like I was supposed to explain it. I couldn't. I called Brenda Fisk, the cemetery administrator, and she arrived 20 minutes later with 3 decades of records and an expression that told me she already didn't like what she was seeing. She went through the plot maps twice, checked the deed transfers, cross-referenced the burial logs. Nothing. According to every official document, that lower coffin didn't exist. Maybe it's from before the records were digitized, she said. But her voice was tight. Old family plot, something that got missed in the transfer. The wood's wrong for that, I said. This wasn't made by a casket company. Someone built this by hand. She told me to handle it through my funeral home, that she'd file the paperwork for an unauthorized burial, and that we needed to resolve this quickly and quietly. The way she said quietly made me understand that this was the kind of problem that creates lawsuits and headlines. Harvey refused to do any more excavation that day. He said he'd heard something while he was digging, something like scratching from underground, and he wasn't going back to that section until we figured out what was down there. I told him it was just tree roots scraping against the bucket. He didn't believe me. I'm not sure I believed myself. We brought both coffins back to the funeral home. Mr. Garrison's was transferred to the new cemetery the next day, and his family never knew about the complication. But the other one, the unauthorized one, sat in our cold storage for 3 days while I tried to figure out what to do with it. My father didn't want me to open it. He actually told me to call the county and let them deal with it, which wasn't like him. Dad's been in this business for 40 years, and he's never backed away from anything. But when I showed him the photographs, when I pointed out the tar seal and the crude construction, something changed in his face. "Don't open it, Todd," he said. "Some things stay buried for a reason. If you've ever kept something you shouldn't have, you know the weight doesn't go away." I opened it anyway. I had to. This is my family's business, and I needed to know what had been buried under one of our interments. The seal broke easily once I applied heat, and the lid came off with a sound like tearing fabric. The smell that came out wasn't decay, it was older than that, something preserved beyond normal decomposition. Inside was a young man, maybe 25, dressed in clothes from the 1970s, bell-bottom jeans, a patterned shirt that would have been fashionable around 75. But the embalming work was Victorian era, the kind of technique that stopped being used before the First World War. Arterial injection points at the carotid and femoral arteries, cavity treatment with what smelled like arsenic compounds, skin preservation that turned the tissue gray and leathery. His hands were bound with wire, thin, rusty wire, wrapped so tight it had cut into the flesh before death, or after, I couldn't tell. And his mouth was packed with something white and grainy. I took a sample, salt mixed with ash. I'd read about this in historical texts, old folk practices from Eastern Europe and rural America. You filled a corpse's mouth with salt and ash, to prevent it from speaking, to keep it from calling out from the grave. I contacted Jenna Morozov, a local historian I'd worked with on a few estate cases. She came to the funeral home that evening and examined the body with the kind of careful distance that told me she'd seen photographs like this in archives, but never expected to encounter the real thing. She took pictures of the clothing labels, the embalming techniques, the bindings. 2 days later, she called me with a list of missing persons reports from 1976. 4 men, all in their 20s, all disappeared within a 6-month period. No bodies ever recovered. The cases went cold. But one of them, Daniel Prast, age 24, matched the general description of the body in our cold storage. "The funeral home where you work," Jenna said carefully. "It wasn't always owned by your family." I knew that. My grandfather bought it in 1977 from the estate of the previous owner, a man named Cyrus Harwell. Harwell had run the business alone, lived in the apartment above the mortuary, kept to himself. He disappeared in December of 1976, just left one day and never came back. The police investigated, found nothing suspicious, assumed he'd started a new life somewhere else. My grandfather got the property cheap through an estate sale. "Did your father ever mention finding anything unusual when they took over the business?" Jenna asked. I told her I'd ask. My father wouldn't talk about it. I brought it up 3 times, and each time he changed the subject or found a reason to leave the room. Finally, I confronted him in his office, showed him the photographs Jenna had uncovered from the newspaper archives. Daniel Prast, missing, last seen near the funeral home. Dad looked at the picture for a long time. Then he told me something I'd never known. When grandfather bought this place, They found rooms in the basement that had been sealed with concrete. Nobody ever opened them. Grandfather said it was probably just old coal storage or root cellars, that it wasn't worth the renovation expense. They just built new preparation rooms on the ground floor and left the basement alone. "You're thinking about going down there," Dad said. I didn't answer. "Some practices," he continued. "In the old days, before regulations, before oversight, some funeral directors took advantage of families who couldn't afford proper burial. They'd take the money, fake the death certificates, and dispose of bodies in unauthorized ways. It was illegal, but it happened more than anyone wants to admit." "And you think Harwell?" "I think," Dad interrupted, "that whatever happened here ended in 1977 when we took over. And I think digging into it now won't bring anyone back or change anything. It'll just destroy our family's reputation and close a business that's been serving this community for 3 generations. I'd like to know if you'd have done the same or walked away." I went to the basement that night. I'd been down there before, but only to the main level where we store old records and supplies. I'd never noticed the concrete wall at the far end, the one that seemed newer than the foundation around it. I brought a sledgehammer from the maintenance closet. The concrete was cheap, badly mixed, probably poured by someone who didn't know what they were doing. It took me 40 minutes to break through. The smell hit me first. Not decay, but something preserved, something held in stasis. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, and the walls were lined with shelves. On those shelves were mason jars. Dozens of them, each filled with a clear liquid that caught my flashlight beam. And in each jar was a tongue. Human tongues, preserved in what I assume was formaldehyde, each one labeled with a date and initials. The dates ranged from 1972 to 1976. The latest jar was marked December 8, 1976, the day before Harwell disappeared. There was a workbench against the back wall with embalming tools laid out in careful rows and a ledger. I opened it. Page after page of names, dates, payments received, services rendered without permits, bodies buried in unauthorized locations, coffins placed beneath legitimate graves where they'd never be found, and notes about the ones who'd resisted, who'd tried to escape or call for help. Those were the ones whose tongues ended up in jars. The last entry was in different handwriting, neater, more controlled. It just said, "The silence is complete." I've been sleeping at the funeral home for the past week because I can't bring myself to leave these records unprotected, and I'm afraid if I take them to the police, my family will lose everything. Every morning when I come down to the preparation room, my tools are moved, not scattered or arranged, positioned the way they are in the photograph of Harwell's workbench, the way someone would lay them out before beginning a procedure. And I hear sounds from the basement, muffled, like someone trying to shout through a mouthful of salt and ash. Harvey won't return my calls. Brenda filed the paperwork for the unauthorized burial, but listed the remains as unidentified and indigent, which means they'll be cremated by the county and never investigated further. Jenna stopped responding to my emails after I told her what I found in the basement. My father hasn't come to work in 5 days. He just leaves messages saying I should close up the unauthorized burial case and move on. But I can't move on, because last night when I was working late in the preparation room, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, shuffling footsteps that stopped outside my door. I waited for someone to knock or speak, but there was only silence. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, but there were wet footprints leading from the basement stairs to where I stood, and they smelled like tar and arsenic and soil that hadn't seen daylight in 50 years. I found something this morning on my workbench, arranged carefully next to my trocar and suturing needles. There was a mason jar I'd never seen before. Empty, clean, and beside it, a label with today's date and my initials. If this part makes you uneasy, maybe it should. It still does for me. I don't know if I'm supposed to report what I found, or protect my family, or run. I don't know if the sounds I hear are real, or if I've been down here too long, breathing formaldehyde and thinking about all the ways silence can be enforced. What I know is this: there are 4 sealed rooms in the basement, and I've only opened one. And every night the footsteps come closer to my door, and my father's final words to me, before he stopped coming to work, were, "Some questions are better left unasked, son, and some debts get passed down." I think I understand what he meant now. I think I'm starting to understand a lot of things I wish I didn't. And I think the empty jar on my workbench isn't a threat, it's an invitation, or maybe a promise. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. The concrete I broke through in the basement has been repaired. I didn't repair it, but it's sealed again, smooth and neat, like it was never touched. And I can't find the ledger anymore. I've looked everywhere, but sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the preparation room, I can hear pages turning in the basement, the soft whisper of paper against paper, like someone's updating records. I need to write this down, while I still remember my own name, because I think I understand now what happens to people who ask the wrong questions, in places where silence has been carefully maintained for decades. I think I understand why my father wouldn't talk about those sealed rooms. And I think I know what's in the other three. But I'm not going to open them. I'm not going to open them because I'm not sure I'll be able to close them again. And because last night, while I was working alone, I heard my own name whispered from the basement in a voice that sounded like it was filtered through salt and ash in 50 years of waiting. If you've ever ignored a warning that came too late, you know exactly what I mean. I need to tell someone about this before I lose the ability to distinguish what's real from what I've convinced myself must be impossible. My name is Christina Vale, and I've been an embalmer for 19 years. I specialize in infant and child cases because someone has to, and I'd always thought I understood the worst kind of grief a parent could carry. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when Garrett Hughes asked me to handle an infant exhumation at Meadowbrook Cemetery. Standard relocation case. The family wanted to move their daughter to a plot closer to where they'd retired. The deceased was Lily Whitmore. Died March 1968 at 11 months old. Cause of death listed as pneumonia. 56 years in the ground. I've done this work enough times to know what to expect. A deteriorated casket, remains reduced to bone, and possibly some mummified tissue depending on soil conditions. Clothing that disintegrates at the slightest touch. You prepare yourself emotionally, because handling a child's remains never gets easier, no matter how long they've been gone. The exhumation was scheduled for 6 a.m. to avoid public attention. If you've ever worked cemetery duty at dawn, you know that strange quiet, the kind that listens back. Tell me if you felt it too. Garrett met me at the site with Sam Pruitt, the cemetery records clerk who'd brought the plot documentation. The grave was in Section C, one of the older areas near the back fence where the headstones lean at odd angles and the grass grows in patches. Lily's marker was small, just a flat granite rectangle with her name and dates. No angels, no lambs, none of the decorative elements you'd expect from that era. Just her name and the words, "Our little one." The backhoe operator worked carefully, and within an hour we'd exposed the vault. Standard concrete enclosure, cracked in several places from decades of freeze-thaw cycles. When we lifted the casket out, I noticed immediately that something was off about the weight distribution. Too light. Infant caskets are small, obviously, but there's usually more heft from the lining and the body itself. This felt like we were lifting an empty box filled with loose gravel. We transported it back to the funeral home and placed it in the preparation room. Garrett stood near the door while I photographed the exterior. White metal, water-damaged and rusted along the seams, with a simple brass nameplate that read Lily Marie Whitmore. The seal had failed long ago, which explained the water damage. I took my time with the documentation, because once you open a child's casket, you can't unknow what's inside, and families deserve thoroughness even decades later. At 9:47 a.m., I broke the seal and lifted the lid. There was no body, no clothing, no blanket or burial gown, just teeth. Hundreds of baby teeth, maybe thousands, arranged deliberately in the shape of a small child. Head, torso, arms, legs, all precisely positioned, as if someone had spent hours creating this horrifying sculpture. The teeth varied in size and color, some still pearl white, others yellowed with age. Many had roots still attached, dark and bloody looking, despite the decades. They weren't scattered or disturbed, they were arranged. Garrett made a sound behind me, something between a gasp and a sob, and I heard him rush from the room. I stood there alone, staring into that casket, trying to make my professional training override the visceral horror of what I was seeing. I counted later, when I could think clearly enough to document, 473 teeth. Dr. Felicity Krause, the forensic odontologist we brought in, would later determine they came from at least 40 different children. Maybe you'd shrug it off too. Maybe that's how it always starts. I called the family first. Alice Whitmore was 83 now, living in an assisted care facility 2 towns over. Her daughter drove her to the funeral home that afternoon. Alice moved slowly, leaning on a walker, and when I brought her into my office to explain what we'd found, her face went through a series of expressions I've never seen before. Confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked like recognition, not surprise. Recognition. "I buried my daughter," she said, her voice steady but thin. "I saw her in the casket. I kissed her forehead before they closed it." "I believe you, Mrs. Whitmore," I said, and I did. But something happened between the viewing and the burial. Someone switched the contents of that casket. She was quiet for a long time, hands folded in her lap, staring at the photographs I'd laid out carefully on my desk. Finally she spoke, and her voice was different. Smaller. "There was a man," she said. "Dr. Pruitt. People called him Doc, but I don't think he had a real medical degree. He ran a dental practice out of his house on Cedar Street. He treated children from poor families for free, pulled teeth, filled cavities. We took Lily to him once, when she was teething badly. He said he could help with the pain." I wrote down everything she told me. Doc Pruitt, no first name she could remember, had lived near the cemetery. He died in 1969, about a year after Lily's burial. House fire. Apparently, no family, no heirs. The property was demolished. Sam Pruitt, the records clerk, had the same last name. I called him that evening and asked if he knew anything about a Doc Pruitt from the 60s. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said, "He was my grandfather. My father never talked about him. Said he was disturbed, that children were afraid of him." Why are you asking? If you felt that shiver in your hands just now, drop a comment, tell me you'd have kept that connection quiet. I couldn't. I told Sam everything. He came to the funeral home the next morning with a box of documents he'd found in his father's belongings after he passed last year. Letters, mostly. Letters from parents in the late 1960s, asking about their children's dental work, asking why their sons and daughters had nightmares about the tooth man, why they woke up screaming about promises of living forever if they gave him their teeth. There were receipts too, all marked paid in full but with notes in the margins, cryptic notations that looked like formulas or instructions. Primary incisor, healthy root, March 14, 1967, subject female, 6 years. Dozens of them. Sam looked sick as we read through them. My father told me once that his father believed teeth held the essence of youth. That if you collected enough from the very young, you could. He stopped, shook his head. It sounds insane, but my father was terrified of dental offices his entire life. Refused to go even when he was in pain. Would you have looked again, or would you have clocked out and never come back? I had to look. We went through the cemetery records together, Sam and I, cross-referencing infant deaths from 1966 to 1969, with plot locations near where Lily had been buried. We found 7 more. 7 infants, all between 8 months and 2 years old, all buried within a quarter-mile of Doc Pruitt's former property line. None of those graves had ever been relocated, despite multiple family requests over the decades. Sam pulled the maintenance logs. Every time an exhumation was requested for those specific plots, something happened: equipment failures, permit delays, families who suddenly changed their minds after receiving anonymous letters suggesting their children should rest undisturbed. Dr. Krause came back with her full report 3 days later. The teeth showed signs of systematic extraction over a period of approximately 3 years, 1966 to 1969. Some had been removed post-mortem, but a significant number showed trauma patterns consistent with removal from living children. Whoever did this, she said, her voice carefully professional, was documenting something. Every tooth was cataloged by age, health, position in the mouth. This wasn't random violence. It was methodical. What were they trying to do? I asked. She looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. I think, she said slowly, they were trying to build something. The report says natural causes, multiple infant deaths from various illnesses across 3 years. But no one can explain why Doc Pruitt's property records show basement renovations in 1966, or why neighbors reported hearing children crying from that house at odd hours, or why 7 families received letters threatening harm if they pursued exhumations. No one but me. And I wish I didn't understand. Because here's what I haven't told anyone yet. what I haven't even written in the official reports. When I was documenting that casket, taking measurements and photographs, I noticed something about the arrangement of teeth. They weren't just positioned in the shape of a child. They were organized by type and age, incisors forming the skull, molars, creating the torso, the smallest primary teeth arranged carefully into fingers and toes. It looked anatomical, purposeful, and at the center where the heart would be, there was a gap, a perfect circular gap, just the right size for one more tooth. I found it 3 days later on my workstation, placed carefully on top of my notes. There was a single baby tooth, small, pristine, with a healthy root still attached, fresh. I checked my tools, my supplies, my inventory. Nothing was missing. That tooth came from somewhere else, appeared in my locked workspace overnight. I had it analyzed. Dr. Kraus called me personally. "Christina," she said, and her voice shook slightly. "This tooth was extracted within the last 72 hours. And the DNA analysis shows something impossible. It matches tissue samples from the Whitmore casket, from teeth removed in 1968. If that part sat wrong with you, if you felt something twist in your chest, say it. I want to know I'm not the only one hearing them. Because I do hear them now. At night when the funeral home is empty, and I'm alone in the preparation room, I hear the sound of small teeth clicking together, arranging and rearranging themselves into patterns I can't quite see. I hear children whispering about the tooth man, about promises that don't die just because bodies do. Sam has stopped returning my calls. Dr. Kraus submitted her report and asked to be removed from the case. Garrett took early retirement last week. Alice Whitmore passed away in her sleep 4 days ago. Natural causes. Her daughter asked me to handle the arrangements, and I couldn't refuse. When I was preparing her body, I noticed something that made my hands shake so badly I had to step away. Alice was missing teeth. 2 molars, extracted recently, according to the healing patterns in her gums, and in her closed right hand, wrapped in tissue paper, was a note in handwriting that looked like it belonged to a 6-year-old child. "Thank you for letting me borrow Mommy's teeth. I'm almost finished now." The casket with the baby teeth is stored in our vault, sealed and cataloged as evidence pending investigation. But every morning when I come in, the seal is broken, just slightly. Just enough that if you looked very carefully, you could see movement inside. A shifting, settling sound, like something rearranging itself into a more complete form. I've requested permission to cremate the contents. I've been denied. The families of the 40 children whose teeth we identified want their remains returned for proper burial, which I understand. But the thought of opening that casket again, of handling those teeth one by one, and trying to determine which belongs to which child, I can't do it. I won't. Because last night I worked late on paperwork, and at 2:17 a.m. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Small footsteps, child-sized. They stopped outside the preparation room door, and I heard breathing. Soft, wet breathing, like someone trying to speak through a mouth that hasn't learned how yet. And then a voice, high and sweet and wrong. "We're almost finished growing. He promised we'd live forever if we gave him our teeth. He promised." The door handle turned, but I'd locked it. The breathing continued for another 10 minutes before the footsteps walked away, clicking on the tile floor with a sound like enamel on stone. The house is quiet tonight. Too quiet. Sometimes I think if I listen close enough, I'll hear the teeth moving again, clicking together in the vault below, building themselves into something that was never meant to be built. And if you do hear it wherever you are, don't answer. Don't go looking. Don't ask what happens to promises made by men who believed death was negotiable. I've put in my notice at the funeral home. I'm leaving this field entirely. Some grief isn't meant to be handled, and some bodies shouldn't be disturbed. The 7 other graves are still there, still sealed, still holding secrets that families have been warned for decades not to uncover. If you'd never step near that place again, subscribe, just so I know someone made it out. I'll write again if it gets worse, but I think worse already happened 56 years ago in a basement on Cedar Street, where a man who wasn't really a doctor convinced 40 children to give him parts of themselves in exchange for immortality. And I think he succeeded, just not the way anyone expected. Some stories don't end, they just wait.